Tonight we are looking at one of the strangest questions in the book of Exodus. Why did Pharaoh keep refusing to let Israel go, even when every refusal brought Egypt closer to disaster? This documentary is about Pharaoh's repeated no. It is about the king of Egypt, who heard Moses demand freedom for the Israelites, saw warning after warning strike his land, watched his own officials begin to fear the collapse of the kingdom, and still could not truly surrender. For viewers who may not know the story well, Exodus begins with the Israelites living in Egypt under oppression. They are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but generations have passed, and they are no longer treated as guests. Egypt has turned them into forced laborers. Their lives are shaped by brick-making quotas, overseers, and the fear of a kingdom that sees them not as a people, but as a workforce. Into that world Moses returns. He does not come back with an army. He does not sit on a throne. He comes with his brother Aaron and a command from the God of Israel, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says no. At first, that no seems like the answer of an empire protecting its power. Pharaoh rules over labor cities, officials, priests, soldiers, and slaves. To release Israel would mean admitting that his authority has a limit. It would mean accepting that the people he controls belong to someone greater than Egypt. But as the story unfolds, Pharaoh's refusal becomes harder to understand. The Nile is struck. The land suffers. The palace loses confidence. His magicians reach the end of their power. His servants warn him that Egypt is being ruined. Darkness falls over the kingdom. And still again and again, Pharaoh says no, or says yes only for a moment before taking it back. That is the mystery at the center of this story. Why would a ruler keep choosing control when control was destroying everything around him? Why would he ask for relief from the plagues, but refuse the freedom that would end them? And what happens when a heart says no? So many times that surrender begins to feel impossible. The biblical text does not give us Pharaoh's private thoughts like a modern novel. It does not explain every movement inside his mind, but it does show us his pattern refusal, fear, bargaining, temporary softening, and then another hardening of the heart. So this is not just a story about plagues. It is a story about power becoming a prison. It is a story about a throne that looked unshakable until each warning revealed how fragile it really was. And it is a story about enslaved people walking toward freedom, while the most powerful man in Egypt kept trying to hold on, even when holding on no longer made sense. Before the river changes, before the sky darkens, before chariots race toward the sea, the story begins in a room of power. Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The palace is not described in cinematic detail by the biblical text, but we can imagine the contrast. Royal stone guards, officials, polished floors, symbols of Egypt's strength, and two Hebrew brothers carrying a message that no slave empire wants to hear. They are not asking Pharaoh to be generous. They are delivering a command. Let my people go. For a broad audience, this sentence needs to be felt before it is explained. Israel is not just a group of workers asking for a holiday. They are a people in bondage, and their God is naming them as his own. Pharaoh sees labor. The command sees a people. Pharaoh sees property. The command speaks of worship, freedom, and allegiance to someone higher than the throne. Pharaoh's answer is cold and direct. He asks who the Lord is that he should obey his voice. He says he does not know the Lord, and he will not let Israel go. In that first refusal, the whole story is already present. Pharaoh does not merely reject Moses. He rejects the idea that any voice has the right to command him. At this early stage, his refusal still makes sense by the logic of empire. Egypt's power rests on hierarchy. Pharaoh commands officials, enforce laborers, obey. If he releases Israel, because their God demands it, he admits that his authority has a limit. For a ruler whose world depends on appearing absolute, that admission may feel more dangerous than the warning itself. But Pharaoh's first no does not stay inside the throne room. It moves outward into the bodies of the enslaved. After Moses and Aaron leave, Pharaoh makes Israel's labor harsher. The people must still produce bricks, but now they must gather straw for themselves. The quota remains. The supply is withdrawn. The work becomes nearly impossible, and the punishment falls on those who already have no protection. This is crucial for the documentary's emotional center. Pharaoh's pride is not abstract. His refusal becomes pain for real families. It becomes exhausted workers searching the fields for straw. It becomes foremen beaten for failing to meet impossible demands. It becomes hope turning for a moment into despair. The Israelites had heard the promise of deliverance, but the first visible result is suffering. That gives the story its first emotional complication. Moses has obeyed the command, but the people's situation has worsened. Pharaoh has not only said no, he has tried to crush the very idea of freedom by making hope feel dangerous. For Pharaoh, this may have looked like strategy. If slaves begin to dream of leaving, make the dream costly. If a messenger speaks of worship in the wilderness, bury the people under heavier labor. If hope rises, answer it with exhaustion. But something has already entered Egypt that Pharaoh cannot control. A command has been spoken in the center of his power, and it did not come from him. A people he thought he could use have been claimed by God. A ruler who has spent his life hearing obedience now hears a demand, and his refusal becomes the beginning of judgment. In the palace, nothing appears broken yet. The throne still stands. The officials still obey. The Nile still runs through the land. Egypt's fields, temples, storehouses, and armies still seem secure. Pharaoh may believe the matter has been settled, but the first no has opened the story, and soon the warning will no longer be carried only by words. It will move into the river. The next stage of the story is not immediate collapse. That matters. Pharaoh does not fall the moment Moses speaks. Egypt does not break at the first warning. For a while, the empire still appears able to answer, imitate, explain, and resist. This is part of what makes Pharaoh's refusal believable in the beginning. His world still gives him reasons to think he can survive the challenge. Moses and Aaron return with signs. A staff becomes a serpent before Pharaoh and the magicians of Egypt appear. These men are not random performers. In the world of the story, they represent the sacred knowledge of Egypt's court, the ritual confidence of the kingdom, and the belief that Pharaoh's world has its own powers standing behind it. At first, they imitate. That imitation is dangerous because it gives Pharaoh comfort. If his magicians can reproduce signs, then perhaps Moses is not carrying anything truly greater. Perhaps this is only a contest between wonder workers. Perhaps Egypt can match Israel's God with its own rituals, its own experts, its own sacred performances in the shadow of the throne. But copying a sign is not the same as controlling what it means. That difference becomes clearer when the Nile is struck. The Nile is not just a river in the Exodus story. For Egypt, it is life running through the land. It feeds the fields, carries boats, sustains animals, shapes agriculture, and marks the rhythm of survival. When the waters are touched by judgment, the sign reaches deeper than spectacle. It touches the bloodstream of Egypt. People search for water. The river that should give life becomes a warning. The place where Egypt felt most secure begins to testify that Pharaoh's command is not the only power moving through the land. Still, Pharaoh hardens his heart. The pattern begins to form. A warning comes. A sign follows. Pressure rises. Pharaoh sees enough to be disturbed, but not enough in his mind to surrender. The palace still has explanations. The magicians still have performances. The king still has distance between himself and the full suffering outside the court. Then the disturbance spreads. Frogs fill spaces where life should feel orderly. The dust itself becomes connected with judgment. Insects move through the land. What began as a confrontation before Pharaoh now enters homes, fields, bodies, and daily life. Egypt is no longer watching a sign in the palace. Egypt is living inside the consequences of its king's refusal. And yet Pharaoh continues. Sometimes he appears shaken. Sometimes he calls Moses and Aaron back. Sometimes he asks them to plead for relief. But relief is not surrender. Fear is not repentance. Wanting the pain to stop is not the same as releasing the people whose bondage caused the confrontation. This is where Pharaoh's psychology becomes dramatically powerful without needing invented thoughts. The story shows a man who wants rescue from consequences, but not release from control. He wants the pressure removed, but he does not want the demand fulfilled. He wants Egypt restored, but not humbled. That is the impossible bargain forming inside his rule. The early plagues also reveal something important about power. Power often survives the first warning because it can still surround itself with voices that say, "This can be managed, it can bring in experts, it can stage a response, it can perform confidence, it can tell itself that nothing has truly changed because the walls are still standing." But beneath the gold of the throne, something is changing. The magicians can still appear, the officials can still wait, Pharaoh can still speak in the language of command. Yet the signs are no longer staying politely within royal space. They are touching the river, the dust, the animals, the homes, and the air itself. Egypt still thinks it has control. Pharaoh still thinks resistance is possible. But the story is about to show the difference between a kingdom that can imitate power and a king who actually has power over what is coming. The illusion is beginning to crack, and when it cracks, it will crack first inside Pharaoh's own court. The first great crack does not come from Moses raising his voice. It comes from Pharaoh's own world. As the plagues continue, the magicians reach their limit. The same figures who once seemed to protect Pharaoh's confidence can no longer imitate what is happening. In one of the most important moments of the story, they tell Pharaoh that this is the finger of God. That phrase lands with quiet force. These are not Israelites speaking. These are not slaves crying out from the brick fields. These are Pharaoh's own sacred specialists, the men whose early success made resistance seem possible. Now even they are saying that something beyond them is at work, but Pharaoh still does not listen. This is where his refusal changes shape. Earlier, he could dismiss Moses as a troublemaker. He could treat Aaron's signs as palace rivalry. He could lean on the magicians and tell himself that Egypt remained equal to the challenge. But now, the illusion is breaking from within. The people who once strengthened his denial now expose it. From this point forward, Pharaoh's no becomes more isolated. He is not only standing against Moses, he is standing against evidence in his own court, fear in his own experts, and damage spreading through his own land. The throne still rises above everyone else, but the room around it is no longer stable. Then the plagues grow heavier. Livestock are struck. Disease touches bodies. Hail shatters the sky and the fields. Locusts threaten what remains. The story moves through the layers of Egypt's life animals, crops, health, food, labor, wealth, and ordinary survival. This is not random spectacle. Each movement strips away another layer of certainty, and Pharaoh begins to bargain. This is one of the most revealing parts of Exodus. Pharaoh is often remembered simply as the king who refused, but the biblical narrative shows something more complicated. He does not always say no in the same way. Sometimes he offers partial permission. Go, but do not go far. Go, but only some of you. Go, but leave the flocks and herds behind. These offers sound like movement, but they are not true release. They are attempts to keep a chain attached to freedom. Pharaoh wants to decide the terms of obedience. He wants Moses' God to remove the pressure, but he still wants to define what release means. This is the heart of his bargaining. He is not asking how to obey. He is asking how much control he can keep. That is why these negotiations carry such tension. In a palace room darkened by disaster, Pharaoh can almost sound reasonable. He can seem flexible. He can appear to be adjusting to reality. But every compromise contains a hidden refusal. He will allow movement but not freedom. He will allow worship but not distance. He will allow some to go but not all. He will allow relief but not surrender. Then the pressure reaches Pharaoh's officials. Before the locusts, his servants ask him a question that makes the entire palace tremble. How long will this man be a snare to us? Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined? This is one of the clearest turning points in the story. Pharaoh's own administration now sees what he refuses to admit. Egypt is being destroyed. The cost of royal pride is no longer hidden among slaves or distant fields. It has entered the conversations of the palace. Imagine the room. Officials standing carefully because they fear the king. Dust in the air. Fields damaged. Animals lost. The people anxious. The court no longer filled with easy confidence, but with a silence shaped by what everyone knows and only some dare to say. The throne is still powerful, but it is no longer unquestioned. Pharaoh listens enough to call Moses and Aaron back, but not enough to truly release the people. Even now, he tries to divide Israel. The men may go, but the families must stay. Freedom must still pass through the filter of Pharaoh's control, and so the refusal continues. By now, every no is more dangerous than the last. Pharaoh is no longer resisting only an outside command. He is resisting the collapse of his own certainty. He is refusing the warning of his magicians, the fear of his servants, the suffering of his land, and the narrowing of his own choices. The palace has become a pressure chamber. Voices are closing in. Consequences are rising. The king who once dismissed Moses now has to summon him again and again. Yet each time Pharaoh comes close to surrender something in the structure of his power, pulls him back. This is not because the story wants us to admire him. It is because the story wants us to see how dangerous power becomes when it cannot admit limits. Pharaoh's decisions are not private mistakes. Every refusal spreads outward. Every hardening makes others suffer. Every attempt to preserve his throne makes Egypt less secure. The crown is still on his head, but it is beginning to look heavy. And the next plague will make that hidden weight visible in darkness. At the center of this Exodus story is a phrase that has troubled readers for centuries. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Sometimes the biblical text describes Pharaoh hardening his own heart. Sometimes it says his heart became hard. And at certain points it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The documentary should not flatten this into an easy explanation. The story allows the mystery to remain, and that mystery is part of its power. What we can see clearly is the pattern. Pharaoh refuses, then pressure comes, then he softens enough to ask for relief, then relief comes and he hardens again. Over time, his refusal stops looking like a single decision and begins to look like a condition. It is as if every no makes the next no easier, and every chance to surrender becomes another chance to become more trapped. This is not a modern psychological diagnosis. The biblical text is doing something older and deeper. It is showing a king whose resistance becomes judgment, and whose judgment reveals the truth of what he has chosen. Pharaoh is not merely unlucky. He is responsible. And yet the story shows his responsibility becoming more terrifying as his heart grows less able to turn. At first, Pharaoh says no. Later, the no seems to have taken root inside him. The plague of darkness becomes the most powerful image of this condition. Darkness falls over Egypt for 3 days. The story describes a darkness that can be felt, a darkness so heavy that movement itself seems to stop. For animation, this scene should breathe slowly. Streets without sunlight, houses, sealed hands searching walls, oil lamps trembling in rooms where no one speaks too loudly. No bright palace courtyard, no shining river, no workers moving normally through the fields, no royal procession under the sun, only shadowed faces, silent rooms, and a kingdom unable to see. By this point, darkness is more than an event outside Pharaoh. It has become the visual shape of his refusal. The land cannot see, and the king cannot truly see either. He can feel consequences. He can hear warnings. He can summon Moses. He can negotiate. But he cannot release the thing he believes must remain under his hand. Even in darkness, Pharaoh tries to keep something back. He tells Moses that the people may go, but their flocks and herds must remain. To a modern viewer, this may sound like a small detail. In the story, it is not small at all. The animals are part of the people's worship journey and future. To keep them behind is to keep leverage. It is another chain disguised as compromise. Moses refuses. Nothing is to be left behind. This moment matters because it clarifies what true freedom requires. Pharaoh is willing to reduce the pressure, but he is not willing to release the claim. He wants a version of obedience that still leaves him with control. But the Exodus story does not present liberation as partial. Israel cannot leave with Pharaoh's hands still closed around their future. The confrontation becomes colder. Pharaoh warns Moses not to see his face again. Moses answers that Pharaoh has spoken rightly. He will not see his face again. The relationship between messenger and king has reached its final human boundary. What began as a demand in the throne room has become a last exchange under the shadow of judgment. The room feels different now from the first confrontation. At the beginning, Pharaoh's refusal sounded like royal strength. Now, after the river, the insects, the disease, the hail, the locusts, and the darkness, it sounds like captivity. The throne is still there, but the king sitting on it has fewer and fewer ways to move. What makes this section so haunting is that Pharaoh has had many chances to change course. He has seen signs before his own eyes. He has watched Egypt suffer. He has heard his magicians admit defeat. He has heard his servants warn that the land is ruined. He has called Moses back more than once. He has stood close to release, then stepped back. His tragedy is not that he never hears. His tragedy is that hearing does not become surrender. And that is why the hardened heart is such a powerful image. It is not merely stubbornness. It is refusal repeated until refusal becomes identity. It is the terrifying possibility that a person can cling to control so long that letting go begins to feel like death, even when control is destroying everything. Still, Pharaoh is not the only center of the story. Outside the palace, Israel is preparing for a night that will divide the old life from the new. Families who have known bondage are about to stand ready. They are about to eat in haste, gather their households, and prepare to move as people who may be called out at any moment. The enslaved are no longer only suffering under Pharaoh's answer, they are standing at the edge of deliverance. But Egypt is not there yet. Pharaoh has not truly released them. The darkness over the land has lifted, but the deeper darkness remains in the place where power refuses to let go. The final warning approaches, and the question that it has followed the whole story becomes almost unbearable. If Pharaoh will not let go after the river, after the land, after the bodies, after the crops, after the sky, after the darkness, then what will it take? And if he finally says yes, Will that yes be freedom, or only another pause before the last no? The final plague comes at night. This part of the story must be handled with restraint. The Exodus narrative describes a devastating judgment across Egypt, and the death of the firstborn breaks the land in a way no earlier plague has done. It is not a scene for spectacle. It is a scene of grief, terror, and silence after cries have risen from house to house. The palace is no longer distant from the suffering. Pharaoh's own house is touched. The king who hardened himself against the pain of slaves now stands inside a night of national mourning. The story does not invite us to enjoy this grief. It presents it as the terrible end of a long refusal. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron by night. The man who once asked who the Lord was now tells them to rise up and go. Israel is to leave. Their families, their flocks, their herds, everything must go. After so many refusals, after so many bargains, after so many attempts to keep something back, Pharaoh finally speaks the words that open the door. But even this release feels forced out of him by devastation. The Israelites depart in haste. For generations, Egypt has been the place of labor, pressure, fear, and command. Now the gates of their old life open in the darkness. Families gather what they can. Animals move through the night. Children walk beside parents. The sound of departure rises where the sound of forced labor once ruled their days. For the first time, Pharaoh's no longer holds them in place. This is the great turn in the Exodus story. Liberation begins not as a calm procession, but as urgent movement. The people do not yet know every mile ahead. They do not yet stand at Sinai. They do not yet understand the wilderness waiting for them. But they are no longer where they were. The house of bondage is behind them. And still the story is not finished. After Israel leaves, Pharaoh changes his mind. The biblical text says that Pharaoh and his servants ask what they have done releasing Israel from serving them. That question reveals the old logic returning. The grief of the night begins to give way to the memory of control. The empire looks at the empty labor force, the vanished slaves, the broken order, and wants its power back. This is the final and darkest reversal. Pharaoh gathers his chariots and his army. The last no is no longer spoken from a throne. It becomes movement. Horses, wheels, dust rising over the wilderness, soldiers moving with royal urgency. The sound of Egypt's power rushing after the people it had already released. This is why Pharaoh's story is so disturbing. His final pursuit shows that his problem was never only refusal in the moment. It was the inability to surrender control, even after control had failed. He let Israel go, but he could not live with the meaning of letting them go. The sea now becomes the final boundary. Ahead of Israel is water. Behind them is Egypt. The people who were freed suddenly see the army approaching and fear rises. From the human point of view, it looks as if liberation has led them into a trap. The wilderness gives them nowhere to hide. The sea gives them nowhere to run. Pharaoh's chariots appear to be closing the story with the same power that began it. But the Exodus story has been moving toward this boundary from the beginning. The throne said no. The river answered. The land answered. The sky answered. The darkness answered. Egypt's own officials answered. Still, Pharaoh pursued control. Now the sea stands before him as the one place where his power cannot simply command its way forward. For Israel, the sea becomes a passage. For Pharaoh, it becomes a limit. The biblical story presents the crossing as the decisive act of deliverance. The waters open for Israel, and the people pass through. The enslaved become a people, walking between walls of water, leaving behind the empire that claimed them. Then the Egyptian army follows, and the power that chased freedom into the sea is overwhelmed. The story does not end because Pharaoh becomes wise. It ends because his refusal reaches a boundary it cannot cross. That is the terrible shape of his fall. He had many chances to release what was not his. He had many warnings before the final pursuit. But each time his need to remain in control was stronger than his willingness to see what his choices were doing. At the beginning, his no sounded like strength. At the end, it sounds like chariot wheels rushing toward destruction. And in the silence after the sea, the meaning of the story widens. Exodus is not only about one king's stubbornness. It is about the God of Israel hearing the cries of the enslaved. It is about liberation from a house of bondage. It is about an empire discovering that people it used as labor were never invisible to heaven. Pharaoh's hardened heart becomes part of that larger story. His refusal does not stop deliverance. It reveals why deliverance is necessary. It shows what happens when power becomes so addicted to ownership that even mercy feels like defeat. The sea closes behind Israel. The throne cannot follow. And so, the question remains in the quiet after the story. Why did Pharaoh keep saying no, even when it made no sense? The answer is not simple, and the biblical text does not reduce it to one motive. Pharaoh says no because he is king. He says no because Egypt depends on control. He says no because surrender would expose the limits of his throne. He says no because each refusal makes the next one easier, until refusal itself becomes the shape of his heart. But the story also moves beyond Pharaoh. It asks what happens when power cannot listen. It asks what happens when warnings are treated as insults, when suffering is ignored because it belongs to the powerless, when partial compromise is used to avoid true release. It asks how long a person, a ruler, or an empire can keep saying no before the world around that no begins to break. In Exodus, Pharaoh's tragedy is that he wants relief without release. He wants the plagues to stop, but not the freedom that would stop them. He wants his kingdom healed, but not humbled. He wants the pain removed, but not the control surrendered. And that is why his story still feels so haunting, because the throne that looked so powerful became a prison. The crown that marked him as ruler became a weight he could not set down. The final chase toward the sea was not only a military pursuit, it was the last movement of a heart that could not let go. For Israel, the sea became a doorway. For Pharaoh, it became the end of the illusion. The story leaves us with a quiet and difficult truth. Not every collapse begins with ignorance. Sometimes people see enough to turn back. They hear enough to stop. They feel enough to know that the path is destroying them. And still they keep saying no. Exodus remembers Pharaoh not because his power lasted, but because it failed at the very point where it seemed strongest. It remembers a king who commanded armies labor riverside cities and trembling officials, yet could not command his own heart to surrender. And in that failure, the story of liberation moves forward, out of the house of bondage, through the night, toward the sea, and beyond the reach of Pharaoh's final no.